Morning, everyone. So, I'm going to talk about the fallacies of A/B testing. Some of you might have heard me give this talk before. I always try and give it a slightly more nuanced flair and spin every time I speak to give you sort of a bit of intro to myself. I've been in the industry about 10 years, and as Joe pointed out, I won the award at the Experimentation Elite Awards last year, and also was a finalist at the Cultural Awards, and got on the top 20 must-know CROs of 2022 as well. So hopefully I know my stuff, but you can tell me at the end of my talk. So I'm going to be talking today about 3 types of planning fallacies, 3 types of statistical fallacies, and then I'm going to try and offer a bit of a hopeful solution. So you've gone from Rowena, where there's no hope. Now you're moving to me, where there's a little bit of hope, and then by the time you get to Chris, it will be quite a lot more hope. So and all of these fallacies are ones that I've either done myself in A/B testing, or I've actually seen someone else do them, and I'm going to be making a few references as well. Throughout, like, take photos and all the things that I've got diagrams for, I've linked to the person who wrote the article, so please just make a note of whoever it was, and you can go and find out. So the first fallacy from prioritization and planning is, I should collect more ideas. So the misconception is that if I have this enormous, amazing backlog of hundreds of ideas, all the possible ideas I could possibly do, I can prioritize and then execute. But the truth is, you're never going to deliver all of them. You might have a backlog with 100 ideas in it, but you're just not going to be able to deliver them all. And also, your priorities are going to change. You might have 100 ideas that make sense right now, but in a year's time, look back and see how many of them you actually delivered, and you might find it's only like 5 to 10 out of those hundreds of great ideas. Every time you run a new experiment, your backlog is going to get out of date as well, because you're going to learn something new. So actually, you might decide to pivot away from what you're already doing. So take a look at this idea backlog from an experimentation program I used to work in. This is just a few rows from a 300-row spreadsheet in Google Sheets that was then converted into a hypothesis list, which was then converted into a rice analysis. So this poor product manager spent a lot of time trying to get this right, came to me, and look, you can see they haven't even filled in their rice at the top here, because by the time they got to this point, they were like, I'm exhausted, I don't know what to do. So in terms of finding a solution, just I know this sounds stupid, but continuously collect data to support new ideas. Continuously be thinking, could I pivot my idea? Could I learn something new? And then when you ideate, disregard any ideas that at the moment are either too small for you to work on in terms of what you think the impact is going to be, or maybe you don't currently have any data to support working on that idea. And then use something like, this is a reference to Itamar Galad, use something like a confidence score, something that will help you to kind of know, well, is this just an opinion? Is it something that a stakeholder told me to do? Or is it something that I have really strong evidence to support? And I really like this quote here from the article, which is, our level of investment in the idea should always stay proportional to our level of confidence in it. So actually being able to, decide how much work you're putting into something based on how much evidence you have to support it. Fallacy number 2, the more A/B tests run, the better the experimentation program. Now, I know probably a lot of you already know this, but it's just not true. A number of experiments does not translate into value for the business or the customer. Any of you who've watched the Jeff Patton video, output versus outcome, it's more important to focus on the outcome than the number of outputs. But actually, there's a lot of evidence that adding lots of features to a website doesn't necessarily increase user productivity. There's a phenomenon referenced in this article called the feature fallacy, which is the idea that actually user productivity kind of plateaus at a certain point and then eventually drops off if you keep adding features to the site. And so the solution is really to accept that it's okay to deliver less stuff if that stuff is genuinely valuable to the customer. Another one, a reference here from what used to be on the Optimizely blog by John Noronha, but I think you can find it on Medium now, but it's looking at actually creating experiments with more variations gives you more horses in the race, gives you more chances to win with the same amount, almost the same amount of build effort. And he goes into more detail on it, but you can see that actually win rate goes up quite a lot because you've got essentially more chances to win in a given experiment if you've got 2 or 3 variants instead of just 1 or 2. They base that on analyzing a load of client-side experiments in Optimizely. And then finally, think about not only a roadmap planned around a mix of different sizes and types of ideas, but also remember that product strategy isn't just like one thing. You might have multiple strategies that you try and work on. This is an example from Apple, again linked by Itamar Galad. where, there's different projects that they worked on, some of which failed and they pivoted away from, but actually the learnings they got from some of these projects led to the ultimate development of the iPhone. So keep different sizes, impacts, approaches, simple tests, complex tests. And then finally, I'll come to this back to this at the end, but consider the value of your ideas at the same time as the velocity of your product delivery or program. So it's not just about output, it's about the outcome and value. Number 3, my favorite, the holy grail of prioritization frameworks is out there. Misconception is that you need a framework to prioritize experiments. So you must have rice or ice or pie or brass. Put your hand up if anyone's heard of brass. No? Okay. Go and look up brass if you've never heard of brass as a prioritization framework. So the truth is that actually using a framework for everything is unmanageable. Like it's okay at sort of small scales where you're trying to choose between 5 or 6 ideas, maybe 10 ideas, but that backlog I showed you at the beginning that have 300 ideas on it is completely unmanageable. And every time you run an experiment, you get new data, so then you have to reprioritize your backlog, and then your next priority is going to change all the time. And also remember that experimentation is an iterative process, not a one-off exercise. So you're going through this whole loop, and each time you repeat it, you're going to learn something new, and you might make decisions. The knowledge you have here when you're creating your hypothesis, by the time, we all know this, by the time you get to here, you're like, oh, I didn't think that was going to win. I didn't think that was going to do well. But actually, you learn something completely different from the process. So the solution, if your experiments are not successful, it's not going to be fixed by having a better priority or a better prioritization framework. It's about reevaluating how you ideate, how you come up with your ideas. Are they based on evidence? How are you writing your hypotheses? Do your experiments match your product goal for what you're trying to achieve with your experimentation program? And then invest in planning and ideation methods that help you develop better ideas, where you dive deeper into the customer and their problems. So this is an example. This is my favorite diagram. If you do nothing else, I'll move over so you can all take a photograph of this without me in the shot, so ruining it. But if you search for Itamar Galad, the confidence meter, this is like my favorite thing on the whole planet. Whenever someone comes to you and says, I've got this great idea, get them to plot it on here. Print a copy of this out, put it up on every pillar and post in your entire office, put one above your head, and every time someone comes to your desk and says, oh, I've got this great idea, show them this and say, well, where does it plot? If it doesn't plot above 1, tell them to go away, basically. Or say to them, this isn't a great idea yet, but maybe we can qualify it together and have a think. You can set up some time to help that person develop the idea further. So we've done the 3 planning fallacies, but now we're going to do the statistical ones. So apologies for everyone whose brain this hurts or breaks in the process. So looking at results early or peaking, I know some of you who are probably a bit more statistically inclined probably all know this already, but it's impossible to interpret the experiment results of a frequentist experiment or the statistical confidence throughout the experiment duration. So the truth is, the results should be analyzed at the end. The frequentist p-values of non-significant experiments or where correct sample has not been reached can take any value. So that means that your wiggly line on your confidence could be at any point, at any time, if it's non-significant. And also early on, the experiment is really influenced by small changes in numbers of unique visitors. So actually, just an extra 10 people in the experiment could really, really swing the results in the first few days. So there's no point in looking at the results. So looking at this example here, you've got a bunch of different results on here. Like if you look at this one, it's run for 34 days, and it's got 80,000 users in it. But if you look at this one, it's been running for 6 days, and it's only got 6,000 or 7,000 users in it total, but it's showing as like 99% confident, right? But there clearly are not enough people, and I know that from my experience of the website that this was taken from, that this is not ready, it's not cooked, right? So it's actually considering, do you peak early, or do you actually want to make sure that you get an accurate result that can be reliable and you can report on it to your leaders? Here's an example of where a product manager came to me and said, oh, look, Ellie, look at this confidence graph. It's like, it's wiggled all over the place. This must be the day that XYZ launched. That's why it plateaued. And I'm like, no, it's just meaningless. Just ignore it. Just go away. And this product manager was so keen. I was like, how long has it been running for? And he's like, oh, 6 days. I was like, no, just go away. What was it sample sized at? And he's like, oh, like 25 days. I was like, just go away. Just don't come back until it's 25 days. And then, don't interpret those day-to-day fluctuations of the confidence. So the solution, interpret all the results with the help of a data scientist or analyst if you have access to one. sample size in advance and stick to it, only interpret the overall result when the experiment is done, and use a rule of thumb. So the business I used to work in, we said 75,000 unique visitors or 3 weeks. So you can see here, there's some really good references here. If none of you have read The Ghosts of Experimentation by Skyscanner, it's amazing. It's so good. There's 4 different ghosts. They're really good. Please, please go and read it. It's got a really, really good way of explaining exactly what I just said in a different way. So number 2, the higher the confidence, the more confident I can be. So the misconception is the statistical confidence value indicates how confident we are in the results, and the more data we collect, the more this value will keep going up or down. And the truth is, it's just not true. So in a frequentist world, statistical confidence is only important if you're at the sample size and it has the following properties. So it's above your chosen threshold. So some of you might have 95 here. Some of you might have 99. Some of you might be, oh, I'm a bit risky, so I'm going to go for 80%. We can talk about that later, maybe over a drink. But if it's positive or negative, it needs to be over 90. If it's 0, it needs to be trending towards 0. And then if you plot the cumulative confidence, it's asymptotic in some way. So I'll show that in just a second. Even so, if you've chosen 90%, there's still a 1 in 10 chance of getting a false positive, so actually reading something that isn't really there. So the solution that we came up with was to actually plot the cumulative confidence and just interpret the overall shape. And again, there's a really good Skyscanner article about it's either significant or noise, so basically it is significant or it's under the threshold and therefore noise. So this is an example of a winning experiment. So you can see here it curves nicely over 90 and then just trends to over 90 and stays there forever. And it doesn't wiggle about up and down. Once it's reached that peak, it just stays up there. When you look at experiments, we've also plotted every single non-significant experiment we had. And you can see what I was trying to describe before, which is it's taking any value between 0 and 1 at any time throughout the duration of the experiment. And it's obviously completely non-significant. But it's only when you compare that first graph to this one that you can really say, oh, yeah, I get it. I can see that that isn't significant. So fallacy number 3, all segments and metrics are created equal. So the misconception is that after an experiment runs, you can analyze any and all metrics and segments equally. And unfortunately, it's just not true. So incorporating a lot of the segments into the post-analysis of an experiment creates 2 possible problems, which I'm going to talk through. One is the multiple comparison problem, or the multiple hypothesis problem, and then also Simpson's paradox. So talking about the multiple comparison problem, again, another really good article from Skyscanner, which I borrowed this diagram from. So when you analyze an experiment and you involve multiple different segments, you're essentially adding an additional hypothesis every single time you add a metric or you add a segment. So you start off with a 10% false positive rate, but actually each time you add an additional number of metrics or segments that you want to analyze, you're actually increasing the amount of false positives you could be getting, because you're it's a compound effect, essentially. And then in terms of talking about Simpson's paradox, it's this weird statistical phenomena that happens where essentially you might get a result that's positive in your individual segments, but then when you sum up the results and look at it in aggregate, it's negative. And it's this weird flipping of results when you change between segments and overall aggregation. And this is an example, again, from Medium, but this person ran an experiment where there was an A and a B variant, and they discovered that when you look at the overall result, it was A won and B lost. But when you looked at it at browser level, B won. And it actually turned out that if you look at the number of people in the Firefox one, there's only 20 people in there, but there's 80 in there. And then in Chrome, there's 20 in there, and there's 80 in there. And so actually, the segments are not equally and evenly sized, and so that's very unfair. So what's happened here, for those of you who can recognize it, is that it's been confounded by an error that's happening outside of what you're testing. And so the solution really is to choose all your metrics and segments before building the experiment and have a think. Do you need to do any corrections? Are you going to have to talk to your analyst to see if there's anything else that you need to do to your data before or afterwards? And you should always use your sample size to inform the test duration. And if you think that you can't do this easily, if you can't get the right segments built in, or if you can't get a good test duration, like is it going to be 27 weeks, is it going to be 2 years, then decide not to do the experiment. Maybe find another way of answering the same question if you possibly can. And again, some more links here on the right. I love links. So I think people can go away and do a lot more reading if they want to. And then finally, what's the sort of solution to some of these issues? So I like to think about how actually you can develop your experimentation program in a way that you're driving both velocity and value. So I'm going to talk through an example of a model that I like to use to try and explain this. So if you think about it, you've got 3 teams, 3 product teams, start working on experiments. And because of the way things fall out, team 1 is going to work on high complexity ideas. Team 2 is going to work on medium complexity ideas, and team 3 is low complexity. And you can use complexity as a proxy for t-shirt size, amount of time to build, amount of components, amount of pages touched, amount of the user journey touched. It's something about it makes it more complicated. And then roughly, because the more complex experiments do more to the user experience, they're going to produce a slightly higher impact, we assume. And then the small, low complexity experiments are going to have less of an impact. So there's sort of like an inverse relationship. But then, because they're so much more complicated to build, you can only build 1 of the high complexity ones a month. And then looking at the low complexity ones, you can build 4 a month, because you can maybe build 1 per week. And so actually, as you're sprinting, you can get through multiple experiments. And so if you look at the way that these plot out, velocity, you can see that team 1 only manages to do 4 experiments in 4 months. So they were the team who could only build 1 experiment a month, so they've got 4 experiments in 4 months. Team 2 could do 8 experiments in 4 months, and then team 3, they could do 16. So when you look at this, you're like, output, huge, amazing. I really want lots of output. Let's do loads and loads of A/B tests so we can learn really, really fast. But remember what I said earlier about how number of experiments run doesn't necessarily translate into overall value. If you plot the value over time, and this is based on some calculations I did using a 20% assumed conversion rate on the site, team 1, so team 3, sorry, the team that were doing 16 experiments, they've actually only produced 4% lift, or it's 4.03% lift in that amount of time. Because although they were running loads and loads of experiments, each experiment was only incrementally driving 1% of lift, and also that is compound, not additive. So it's actually each time it's 1% of 1% of 1%. Whereas you look at team 1, who were doing fewer but bigger experiments, they're on a stonking 13.7% off of 4 experiments, which is amazing. So when you actually plot these all together, you can see that in terms of cumulative velocity, so number of experiments run, going up to 16 for team 1, they've only got 4% lift. Team 2, 9.9%, team 3, 13.7%. So if you're looking at your output and outcome, actually, I've done fewer experiments, so I've had to build less stuff, but I've actually produced the most value. Now, obviously, this is just an abstract model, right? This is completely, abstracted out from being in a real product team looking at real things. But the idea is that we should really be driving to do maybe be team 2, where we're doing a mixture of different experiment sizes, and some of them are a bit small, and some of them are a bit bigger, but hopefully we can do more value for the customer in less time and with fewer experiments. So that's kind of the end of me explaining how to use the real value model, and my summary and key takeaways for all of you are, don't get paralyzed by prioritization. Embrace the possibility that you might get it wrong, but you will learn. Be open to pivoting away from an idea. Don't stick with an idea if you're just getting consistently in non-significant or negative results from it. Check your stats, check them, and then check them again, and maybe check them again, and then also check that they're GDPR compliant. And then finally, think about how you can optimize for value versus velocity. What is the version that works for you in your product team, in your experimentation program, that means that you get the most value out of and also the most velocity out of your product and your team? So that's me finished.